Nassau was never a quiet place. Not after the wars, not after the privateering licenses dried up and left thousands of hard men with sea legs, scarred knuckles, and no lawful paycheck to chase. It sat there in the Bahamas, like a crooked grin, sunlit, shallow-watered, half-built and half-burnt. It was a place where rum moved faster than rules, and a man's reputation could be bought, borrowed, or stolen in a single night. You didn't walk into Nassau with clean hands. If you did, you didn't keep them that way for long. John Rackham arrived like so many others without a grand entrance, just another sailor with sharp eyes and an appetite for more than a wage. No one called him Calico Jack at first. Names like that had to be earned, pinned onto a man by other men, a shorthand for what he represented. But Rackham had a flair for display. In a port where everyone wore torn linen or salt-stiff wool, he dressed himself in bright calico cloth whenever he could get it. It said, "Look at me, I've got something you don't." It said, "I'm not ashamed of wanting." He didn't take a ship the way the legends make it sounds, washbuckling, sword in teeth, roaring with laughter. Piracy was paperwork and opportunity as much as it was violence. It was alliances, betrayals, drinking contests, and whispered deals in hot rooms. Rackham attached himself to the right people at the right time. He sailed under captains with real teeth before he ever commanded anything himself, and that meant he watched. He learned what made men loyal: coin, fear, admiration, and what made them mutiny. He learned the most dangerous fact of all: crews weren't owned, they were convinced. Nassau, in those years, was a floating argument about freedom. Pirates talked about liberty as if it were a gospel. They elected captains, they divided loot by agreement, but there was always the other truth. This freedom depended on taking from other people, and it lasted only as long as the world couldn't stop them. The British Empire didn't forget it tolerated chaos until chaos became expensive. When Woodes Rogers arrived to make Nassau behave, he did it with the efficiency of a man who believed disorder was a disease. He brought the king's pardon like a net full of glittering bait. Some pirates took it, some laughed at it, most hovered in between. Rogers wanted cutlasses, hung up like old tools. He wanted the sea to become a place of commerce again, not predation. Rackham, for a time, played the game. He wasn't stupid. He understood that a pardon could be a shelter, a chance to breathe, a chance to step out of the thunderstorm long enough to sharpen a knife. But Rackham wasn't built for quiet. Quiet didn't buy calico, quiet didn't buy rum for a dozen friends at once. Quiet didn't make strangers turn and stare when you walked into a room. And then Nassau introduced him to the kind of trouble no governor could legislate away. Bonny didn't walk into history softly. She arrived like a thrown bottle. People turned to look because she made them. Maybe it was the red hair, maybe it was the way she moved, like she didn't owe anyone the performance of gentleness. She had the look of someone who'd been told no too many times and decided the word had no authority. The stories say she was born in Ireland, raised with scandal, carried into the colonies on a wave of family shame. Wherever she came from, she didn't grow into obedience. Some men fall in love with a woman's beauty. Other men fall in love with danger, and they recognize danger when it smiles. Rackham, already half addicted to risk, met Bonny and saw a wildfire that could burn down every sensible plan he ever had. Bonny was married, then to James Bonny, a man whose name survives mainly because it was attached to hers. In Nassau, marriage didn't always mean devotion, it often meant possession, and Bonny did not carry herself like property. She and Rackham didn't begin as a tidy romance. Nothing in their world was tidy. It was glances, rumors, arguments, and laughter that was too loud. It became a slow, public scandal. Nassau was small enough that secrets didn't stay secrets. They just traveled faster. Soon everyone knew. Soon the governor knew. And in that knowledge was a threat. Rogers could forgive piracy, sometimes, but he couldn't forgive making a mockery of the social order he was trying to restore. Rackham could have stepped away. That's the part people forget. Every legend makes it sound like fate. But piracy was made of choices, and this was one of them. He could have accepted the pardon fully, sailed lawful routes, and grown old. Instead, he chose Bonny, and with her, he chose the kind of life that ends in a courtroom or a noose. It happened the way storms build little pressures accumulating until the air can't hold them anymore. Rogers pressed down. The town tightened. Men with pardons were watched, and Rackham, itching for the sea, began to look at the law like a chain. There was another influence too. The pirates around him, they traded stories like currency, scoffing at the idea of working for wages again. Every time Rackham heard those voices, the sea called to him like an old addiction. So when the opportunity came, a small sloop, a handful of men willing to gamble, a night dark enough to hide a theft, Rackham didn't hesitate. He took a vessel and fled Nassau, breaking his pardon with the casual arrogance of a man who believes consequence is for others. And Bonny went with him, not as a passenger, not as a lover, as part of the crew, as a partner in flight. Out on the water, the rules changed. On land, Bonny would always be watched through the lens of what she was supposed to be. At sea, she could be what she chose. That didn't mean acceptance came easily. Pirate crews had their own superstitions about women aboard ship. But Bonny wasn't asking for permission. She was making an offer. I will fight, I will bleed, I will take risks beside you. If you want to challenge me, do it with steel. Rackham needed her strength. His leadership wasn't the iron discipline of a seasoned terror. He was charismatic and daring, but he was also indulging himself. He liked the look of piracy, its theater, its flags and rumor. In Bonny, he had someone who didn't just admire the theater, she could perform it better than any man. They gathered a crew that fit them, restless, reckless men. And somewhere in that mix was another figure who would make this story burn even brighter. Mary Reed, not yet revealed as a woman, but another hard soul who had learned to survive by refusing to be easily categorized. Rackham raised his famous flag, black cloth, a skull, and crossed blades. He understood symbols. He understood that terror traveled faster than cannon fire when it had an image he wanted his. Enemies afraid before the fight even began. And so their little floating outlaw kingdom began to form. Rackham at the center, and Bonny beside him, and a crew hungry for plunder. They were not yet the hunted. They were still in the stage of believing they were untouchable, where each successful raid feels like proof that the world's laws don't apply. That illusion is the most intoxicating rum of all. They moved like thieves along the edges of the Caribbean, snatching small vessels, taking what could be taken quickly. It creates victims who remember faces, voices, and flags, and those victims carry their fury back to the nearest authority with guns. Rackham and Bonny, in those early days, didn't think like fugitives. They thought like performers. They let themselves be seen. They laughed too much. They drank too long. They wanted stories told about them. They wanted their names carried from port to port, like scandal and scandals. In the colonies, didn't stay harmless. Scandals turned into warrants, warrants turned into hunts. Every ship they robbed was another thread, every dockside boast was another clue. Rackham's broken pardon turned from a shield into a trap. It marked him as a man who had been offered a way out, and spit in the king's eye. That kind of defiance demanded an example. As Rackham's little band drifted toward Jamaica's richer waters, the horizon ahead didn't just hold opportunity, it held the shape of something closing in. Law, anger, and ships commissioned to hunt them down. And Bonny didn't flinch. She had chosen her side. She had chosen the sea over the cage of respectability. And now the sea was about to choose what it always chooses in the end, whether to let you keep what you stole, or whether to take you back. Rackham still thought he could dance faster than the storm. The closer Jack Rackham steered toward Jamaica, the more the sea stopped feeling like a playground and started feeling like a marketplace. This was a place packed with money, men with something to lose, and schedules that repeated like clockwork. The Bahamas had taught him how to raid. Jamaica would teach him what it meant to be hunted. In the low, humid ports around the island, sugar made fortunes in silence. Ships moved like veins around a beating heart. Small boats carried goods to larger vessels, which carried wealth out to the empire. This system bred a predictable complacency. Captains believed the route itself was protection. Merchants assumed the law would always arrive in time, but pirates live on complacency. They thrive in that gap between a robbery and the moment authorities decide it matters enough to stop. Rackham's crew loved the Jamaica run. It offered prizes that were small enough to overwhelm, but valuable enough to be worthwhile. They weren't taking massive galleons. They were snatching sloops and fishing boats, grabbing quick cargoes, and stripping ships of anything that could be sold them: cloth, weapons, provisions. It was piracy, the way street theft is crime, fast, opportunistic, and unglamorous if you looked closely, but its ease was addictive, and that ease is what began to rot them. It wasn't just that they were stealing, it was how they were living. They acted like people who believed the future didn't exist. When plunder came aboard, it didn't turn into discipline, it turned into drink, it turned into noise. Rackham's command style, loose as a shirt collar after too much rum, encouraged it. He wanted to be liked, to hear the crew cheering his name, not fearing it. There are captains who rule by terror, and those who ruled by charm. But charm has a flaw. It doesn't hold men steady when the cannons start talking. They made islands into temporary homes, raiding by day and feasting by night. On deck, laughter rolled over the dark water. Down below, stolen provisions stacked up like trophies. Somewhere along the way, the crew stopped behaving like fugitives and started behaving like kings. And Bonny stayed sharp through it all. She drank with the others, yes, and she laughed too, but there was a difference. Some pirates drank to forget the danger. Bonny drank as if daring the danger to come closer. Stories about her temper, her readiness to strike, and her refusal to accept insult spread like fire. People are always hungry for something that breaks the rules. A woman with a blade, a woman who curses, a woman who fights. That was a tale that grew larger each time it was told. Mary Reed's presence was solidified during these raids. On a pirate deck, competence is what matters. Skill with steel, steadiness under pressure. Reed had that. She moved with the economy of someone who'd spent a lifetime navigating violence. In time, Bonny and Reed became a kind of unspoken spine for the crew. Two figures who didn't drift into sloppy comfort as easily as the men did. And the men did drift. They drifted into an arrogance so strong it became blindness. They began boarding vessels without caution, believing fear would do half the work. They started leaving witnesses alive, not out of mercy, but out of laziness and drunken distraction. The most dangerous thing Rackham did wasn't robbing ships. It was allowing his name to become consistent, his pattern to become obvious. When you steal from one man, it's a crime. When you steal from many men in the same place, it becomes a problem that demands a solution. Along Jamaica's coast, complaints began stacking up like storm clouds. Merchants demanded protection. Fishermen described men spilling over their decks, a brightly clothed captain at the center, like some gaudy devil. And they described women among the attackers in detail so unusual it was repeated most of all. Even those who only saw shadows swore they'd seen them. Two figures, moving fast, shouting, fighting. In taverns, these stories turned fear into anger. And anger, when it reaches the right ears, becomes action. Jamaica was not Nassau. Nassau had flirted with piracy. Jamaica was wealthy and valuable. Its governors had no interest in letting pirates turn their sea lanes into a circus. They had troops, ships, and political pressure from London. Piracy wasn't just theft, it was an insult to the empire. What made the authorities move faster was the humiliation. Rackham's crew acted like they were mocking the island. They raided close to shore, close enough to almost hear them laughing. In one incident, after taking a ship, they didn't disappear. They lingered. They lingered to drink, to divide the spoils, to boast. They lingered because the night felt safe. That was the turning point, when the pirates began to trust the night more than they feared the law. Rackham's sloop became a floating tavern. Quarrels flared, men wrestled. Someone sang too loudly. The sea listened in silence. The sea always listens. Most pirates didn't die in glorious cannon duels. They died because of downtime, because of the hours between raids where discipline decays, where watchmen fall asleep, where captains stop thinking like predators and start thinking like celebrants. Rackham and his crew began acting like they couldn't be surprised, but the island was watching, and islands don't forget threats. Word reached officials not just that Rackham was active, but that his men were sloppy, and sloppy pirates are easier to catch. Rackham's success had become an open bounty in spirit, a promise that whoever brought him in would be praised and paid. That's where the hunt truly began, not from heroic naval duty, but from colonial necessity. Jamaica's government couldn't afford to look weak. So, men were commissioned, crews prepared, and ships readied, not massive warships, but fast vessels built for pursuit. The sea around Jamaica was a chessboard. Rackham knew its reefs and coves, but Jamaica's hunters knew them too, and they had official permission to be relentless. As Rackham kept raiding, the crew's mood began to split. A few men sensed the net tightening. They urged Rackham to move farther, to lay low. Others wanted the opposite. One more raid, one more night of drink. Rackham listened to the loudest voices. He wanted to keep them happy, and keeping them happy meant indulging them. And Bonny's presence shaped the crew. She was feared and respected, a paradox that unsettled some men, but no one could deny her utility. When violence came, she didn't freeze. When threats were shouted, she shouted back. She fought with the confidence of someone who had already rejected the world's judgment. Bonny fought for identity, for freedom. But even she couldn't force discipline into a crew drunk on its own myth. The raids continued. laying another plank in the bridge, leading straight to confrontation. On shore, the response grew colder. Men in offices drew lines on maps. Witness testimony was gathered. The hunt was organized like a business. And then came the kind of night that turns rumor into history. Rackham's crew anchored near the coast, in waters they believed were safe. The rum flowed. The deck turned into a world of loose limbs and loud voices. The watch slackened, eyes closed. A man who should have been looking out was laughing instead. By later accounts, Anne, Bonny and Mary Reed weren't as deep in the stupor as the others. But even they couldn't override the atmosphere Rackham had allowed. A floating party with stolen sails. Out in the darkness, another vessel moved. A hunter with purpose. Its crew sober, its captain intent. It didn't need to be a massive navy ship to be terrifying. All it needed was surprise. As the hunter ship closed in, there was no warning cannon, no demand to surrender. It was the kind of approach men use when they want success more than spectacle. In that narrowing gap, between drunken laughter and sudden fear, Rackham's crew was about to learn the difference between being feared and being found. The night had been theirs for months, but now it was about to belong to someone else. The hunter didn't arrive like thunder. It arrived like a blade quiet until it was too close to dodge. Out on the dark waters off Jamaica, the night could be a pirate's best friend. It hid ships in coves and swallowed the outline of their sails. But darkness could also be a weapon used against them. The difference, always, was discipline. Whoever stayed sharp owned the night. Captain Jonathan Barnett's vessel moved with the steady purpose of a man who was not there to argue. Barnett wasn't chasing Calico Jack Rackham for glory or romance. He was chasing him because Jamaica wanted its lanes quiet again. A pirate captain who'd already broken a royal pardon was a problem that could not be allowed to feel permanent. Barnett had authority behind him, and that authority mattered. It meant he could use force without fearing consequences. It meant he could be patient. He could stalk. The sea carries sound, strangely at night, but it carries carelessness even more clearly. A disciplined crew learns to hear the faintest odd note, a change in the rhythm of the waves, the creak of unfamiliar rigging, the sudden hush of men trying not to be heard. But Rackham's crew, bloated with rum and overconfidence, wasn't listening. Their ship, the Revenge, sat anchored as if the water itself were holding it for them. Their world had shrunk to laughter, drunken quarrels, and the warm, fuzzy numbness of drink. Barnett's men, on the other hand, were sober. Their bodies were ready, their hands knew the shape of their weapons by feel alone. When the distance finally collapsed, when Barnett's vessel drifted close enough for voices to carry across the water, there was no dreamy transition from celebration to combat. It was a jolt, a tearing of reality. One moment, Rackham's deck belonged to pirates who believed they were untouchable. The next, fear moved through them like a blast of cold water. Shouts went up. Someone stumbled. A pirate reached for a pistol and fumbled it, dropping it to the deck. Another just froze, still half lost in the fog of rum. A ship at anchor can feel like home. That illusion shatters when enemies appear at the rail. Barnett hailed them. Accounts differ on the exact wording, but the message was the same. Surrender, you're surrounded by lawful force. There is nowhere to run. Rackham had a decision to make, and he only had heartbeats to make it. A captain's true nature is revealed in the first seconds of an ambush. Rackham had built his leadership on charm, on swagger, on the idea that he could bend the world to his will through pure audacity. But now, audacity demanded a payment in blood. He tried to rally his men, but trying to rally drunk men is like trying to steer smoke. A few moved, most just hesitated. The louder Barnett's presence became, the more Rackham's crew turned inward, toward their own survival rather than defiance and survival. For frightened men, often looks like hiding. Some of the crew scrambled below deck. They vanished into the cramped belly of the ship, where shadows and barrels could be mistaken for protection. Others stayed topside but moved as if they were underwater, slow and uncertain. No one wants to be the first to die in a fight they didn't choose. No one wants to take a musket ball for a captain who spent the loot on rum instead of readiness. Barnett's ship pressed closer. A clash began, brief, ugly, and decisive. This wasn't the kind of battle that fills paintings with heroic poses. This was confusion, shouted commands, the scrape of wood, and the crack of gunfire. Deafening in the night, the real contest wasn't between cannons, it was between panic and resolve. And that's where Anne, Bonny and Mary Reed came into sharp relief. They didn't run whatever else history argues about them, what they wore, how they lived among the men. How much of their legend was built Later the accounts all converge on this one point. When Rackham's crew faltered, Bonny and Reed did not. They fought, and they fought hard, with a fury that seemed to embarrass the men who were retreating. It wasn't just bravery, it was rage. Rage at the cowardice surrounding them. Rage at the sudden collapse of the myth they'd all been living inside. Rage at the men who had talked so boldly during raids but now melted away when real opposition appeared. Bonny shouted at them, cursing, demanding they come up and fight like men. Reed did the same. It wasn't a gentle urging. It was pure contempt. It was the kind of scolding language that strips excuses down to the bone. They didn't plead. They didn't flatter. They called the men exactly what they were acting like. The deck became a strange tableau. Two women fighting as the spine of the ship, while the men, these supposedly fearless sea-wolves, hid below like rats. Barnett's crew, seeing this, pressed their advantage. They weren't there to admire courage. They were there to win. They moved with trained efficiency, boarding and overpowering the remaining pirates. Their numbers and their sobriety decided the outcome. A drunk pirate can be dangerous in a tavern brawl, but in a coordinated sea capture, drunkenness is a death sentence. Rackham tried to fight, but the fight was already lost. His crew had broken the moment fear arrived. Once a crew breaks, the captain is just a man waving a sword in the wind. The boarding was brutal and fast. Hands grabbed rigging, boots slammed onto planks, steel flashed in the moonlight. Someone went down hard. Someone screamed. The fight didn't stretch into some long heroic stand. It snapped shut like a trap. Within minutes, the pirate's sloop was no longer Rackham's world. It was Barnett's. Bonny and Reed were finally overwhelmed, not because they lacked courage, but because courage doesn't stop ropes, pistols, and superior numbers. They were seized, bound, and dragged back from the rail, spitting insults and threats the entire time. The humiliation of it being physically restrained, while the men who should have fought alongside them lay hiding only, sharpened their anger. Below deck, Barnett's men found the rest of the pirates huddled like children in a storm. These were men who had terrorized merchants, who had thrust pistols into trembling hands, and now they just blinked up at authority with slack mouths and shaking limbs. The story would later emphasize this part, and for good reason. Piracy sells itself on an image of fearlessness. The capture exposed just how thin that fearlessness could be when discipline was absent. Rackham was taken alive. That was important. The authorities didn't want his body drifting in the sea. They wanted him in chains, where everyone could see him. Pirates die all the time, but a public hanging isn't just death, it's theater, used by the state to send a message. Barnett's ship turned for Jamaica, with prizes more valuable than stolen rum or cloth. Living symbols, a pirate captain with a broken pardon, a crew that could be paraded through the streets, and two women whose very presence would make the entire colony buzz like a struck hive. The voyage back was short but heavy. The sea, which had been Rackham's ally, now felt like a corridor leading to judgment. In the weak light of morning, the pirates looked different, smaller, dirtier, and terribly human. The Empire's power works best when it forces rebels to look ordinary. Bonny and Reed sat bound like the others, but their posture still carried something stubborn. Captivity didn't soften them. If anything, it made them sharper, like trapped animals watching for any moment to bite. Rackham, meanwhile, had the look of a man whose fantasy had finally been punctured. This wasn't Nassau where chaos ruled. This wasn't a merchant sloop whose captain could be threatened into surrender. This was official capture. This was paperwork. This was law. This was the machinery of the Empire, and it did not care how bright his clothes were. The pirates were delivered to the island like contraband. News ran ahead of them. By the time they arrived, people were already gathering not to welcome them, but to stare. Staring was part of the punishment. Even before the gallows, shame was a noose. Jamaica's officials wanted speed. They didn't intend to let Rackham's name inspire anyone else. Trials would follow. Yes, but the outcome was never really in question. The point of the trial was not to decide guilt. It was to make guilt official. In custody, the crew began to fracture even further. Fear turns comrades into informants. Some men tried to bargain. Some tried to shift blame. The old pirate code, whatever loyalty it had promised, collapsed under the weight of each man's survival instinct. Every man was suddenly alone, and in being alone, he was willing to say whatever the state needed to hear, and that state needed one thing most: a clean story. They needed Rackham, labeled the villain, his crew labeled criminals, and the capture labeled as justice. They needed the island to believe the sea was safe again. They needed merchants to unclench their fists and keep their ships sailing, Captain Barnett had done his part. Now the courts would do theirs. Rackham and his crew were marched toward Spanish Town, toward cells and interrogations, toward judges who would not be charmed by Calico. The pirates' world narrowed from the open horizon to a cramped hallway, from wind and water to walls and iron. Shackles replaced cutlasses. The smell of salt gave way to the smell of sweat and stone. Still, even here, especially here, the legend began to take shape. The sight of Bonny and Reed in chains was too potent to stay simple. People argued about them immediately. Were they monsters? Were they marvels? Did their presence prove the devil could wear any face? Men who'd never even met them formed opinions like weapons. And inside that storm of gossip, the truth remained stark and unromantic. Rackham's crew hadn't been beaten by superior firepower. They had been beaten by readiness, by sobriety, by the simple fact that the law had finally shown up in force on the exact night the pirates chose to relax. That's how most outlaws fall, not in their strongest hour, but in their weakest. As the prisoners were processed, as names were written down and charges prepared, and Bonny looked at the men who had hidden below deck and saw something she might never forgive. Not the capture itself, but the cowardice that made it inevitable. In her mind, the Empire hadn't won because it was righteous. It had won because the pirates had forgotten what they were. And now, there would be no returning to sea to correct that mistake. The only voyage left was toward judgment, toward the courtroom, the sentence, and whatever slim chance could be clawed from the wreckage of their choices. The shackles had a way of shrinking a person. Out on the water, Calico Jack Rackham had been a man who occupied space. Bright cloth, bright confidence, a captain's strut built on the belief that the world could always be tricked. But in custody, stripped of his freedom and reduced to a name on a piece of paper, he became smaller. Jamaica didn't want pirates to seem glamorous. It wanted them to seem pathetic. It wanted every sailor watching from the wharf to think, that could be you, if you're foolish enough to try. Spanish Town carried that power. The former capital sat inland, the island's stern, stone heart. It wasn't a bustling port where pirate bravado could flourish. It was where the colony reminded itself it was governed by law and order. Rackham and his crew were marched through that world as prisoners, and the sight did exactly what officials hoped. It drew people like flies to blood. Some came to jeer, some to stare in cold fascination. For many, fear had finally turned into curiosity, the same dark impulse that fills execution grounds. The pirates were handled like symbols, not people. The paperwork moved fast. Piracy trials were not built for suspense. The law had already decided what pirates were: enemies of all, criminals outside ordinary protection. In a colony where trade was survival, piracy wasn't a colorful nuisance. It was an existential threat. The government had no intention of showing mercy, because mercy looked like weakness. Even before the court convened, the cage began to work its magic on the men. A pirate crew holds together best when the sea still offers escape. Once that's gone, loyalty rots. Men start counting the hours. They start offering information in exchange for the smallest comfort. They start twisting their own stories to fit whatever might buy them one breath longer. Rackham's crew had already shown how quickly they could break under pressure. Now, in their cells, they broke in quieter ways: arguments, accusations, resentments, finally given voice. It's one thing to drink together after a raid, laughing at danger. It's another to sit beside the same men when you can smell the gallows waiting for you. Anne Bonny endured captivity differently. People watched her closely, trying to decide what she was supposed to be. They wanted her either repentant or monstrous. They didn't know how to process her as simply stubborn. She wasn't docile in chains. She didn't soften. If anything, captivity seemed to sharpen her contempt, the way a caged animal grows more dangerous for having nowhere to go. Mary Reed carried that same hard stillness. Reed's strength didn't come from performance. It came from endurance. She had survived too much to fold neatly now. The court could take her freedom, but it couldn't easily take the iron she'd built inside herself. When the day came for the trials, Spanish Town became a stage. Rackham stood first, because he mattered most to the authorities. He wasn't just another pirate. He was a captain, a name, a symbol. Worse, he was a man who'd been offered a royal pardon and had violated it. That wasn't just illegal, it was insulting. It told the colony that pirates could laugh at mercy. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Captured pirates were living evidence. The loot, the testimonies from victims, the witness statements, it all built a wall too high to climb. There was no dramatic legal chess match. Rackham was not going to talk his way out of this. The trial was a formality, designed to turn vengeance into procedure. He was convicted quickly. Somewhere in the crowd, people who had once feared his name felt a sense of relief. Not admiration, not even hatred anymore, just relief. This is how states crush rebels, not just by killing them, but by changing how they are remembered. Rackham's sentence was death. He was taken back to his cell to wait, and waiting is its own special kind of punishment. Men can survive pain in the moment, but waiting stretches the mind until it begins to chew on itself. In those final days, Bonny must have watched him with a cold kind of clarity. Rackham hadn't just led them to capture, he had let the crew become a drunken caricature of itself. He had let them forget vigilance, and when the net snapped shut, he hadn't inspired his men to fight their way out. Bonny was never going to pretend she didn't notice. If the later stories are true, it's because she hated cowardice more than she feared death. Cowardice offended her. It was the one sin she could not excuse, because it was chosen. And Rackham, for all his bright cloth and pirate swagger, had presided over cowardice like a king presides over rot. When the other men of the crew were tried, their convictions followed the same hard line. The courts weren't interested in nuance. Some may have begged, some may have cursed. It didn't matter. The colony needed the spectacle of justice, and it needed it now. Then, Bonny and Mary Read were brought forward. And this is where the story catches fire, because their presence disrupted the script. Jamaica knew how to hang pirates. Hanging pirates was routine, but hanging women who had fought, who had joined raids, turned punishment into controversy. The colony couldn't help itself. Everyone wanted to see them, to measure them with their eyes, to decide if they were demons or just women who had wandered into the wrong world. They were convicted, just like the men, but there was an ancient loophole in English law, one designed to protect the unborn. It was called pleading the belly. If a condemned woman claimed to be pregnant, her execution would be delayed. So, Bonny and Read used it. They pleaded the belly, and the court was forced to pause. Examinations were conducted, and the sentences were stayed. In that moment, the two women did what pirates always do. They exploited a crack in the system. It wasn't romance, it wasn't heroic, it was survival. But Mary Read would not survive long enough to see if that delay could have become freedom. She fell ill in prison. The records point to a fever, likely from the brutal conditions, filth, cramped air, sickness moving through the cells like smoke. Read died before the hangman could ever claim her. Her death is often treated like a footnote, but it's perhaps the most honest ending in the entire story. Piracy didn't kill her in battle. The Empire didn't even kill her cleanly. Prison killed Hertha, slow, indifferent kind of violence that doesn't produce legends, but does produce bodies. Bonny's fate, by contrast, becomes a mystery shaped by rumor. She doesn't appear in the records as executed, the way Rackham does. That absence opened the door for every kind of speculation. Some said her wealthy family ransomed her. Some said she was quietly released and smuggled away to avoid scandal. Others claimed she started a new life under a different name. The truth is, history doesn't always preserve endings equally. Men like Rackham were useful as warnings. Their bodies could be displayed, their deaths made into a lesson. A woman like Bonny was harder to use. The state didn't want her to become a folk hero. It didn't want young women to hear her name and imagine freedom. So if she vanished into bureaucracy or private bargaining, that disappearance makes a certain kind of sense. Sometimes the state's best weapon isn't the spectacle of punishment, but the quiet erasure of the inconvenient. Still, there was one last dramatic flair that clung to the story like salt. Before Rackham's execution, Bonny is said to have visited him. Legend claims she spoke to him with honesty sharpened into a blade. If you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog. Whether those exact words were spoken is almost beside the point. They ring with the emotional truth of who Bonny was understood to be: someone who would not soothe a failing man, someone who would not perform softness just because the world expected it. Rackham was hanged in November 1720. His body was displayed afterward, a grim roadside sign for the sea. The Empire didn't just kill pirates, it exhibited them. It turned their corpses into warnings, their bones into billboards. Any sailor passing by would see what defiance brought you. And with his hanging, the story achieved its official ending. Pirate captain defeated, commerce restored, law triumphant. But stories don't stay official. In taverns and ports, the tale traveled differently. It wasn't just about Rackham's failure. It became about Bonny and Mary Read standing on deck while the men hid below. It became about fury and courage, and the strange inversion of expectations. Women fighting while men cowered. That detail was too potent to die quietly. It turned the capture into a myth. Jamaica wanted the lesson to be, piracy ends in a noose. But the world, hungry for something more complicated, heard a different lesson, that the line between civilized and savage, between man and woman, between coward and brave, is thinner than anyone wants to admit. And the sea, indifferent to all categories, will expose what you really are the moment the dark fills with sails. The pirates were meant to vanish as warnings. Instead, they endured as a story one, where the night belongs to whoever is ready, and where myth, once born, keeps sailing long after the bodies are gone.